The forest clung to the mist like a lover to a secret, its trees standing tall and skeletal, their twisted branches forming a canopy that choked out even the dimmest rays of moonlight. Beneath this oppressive veil, Kael trudged forward, his breath misting in the cold night air. The path he followed was little more than a memory, a faint trail swallowed by the overgrowth and fog, barely discernible to anyone who did not already know its existence. But Kael had studied every map, every whispered tale, and every forbidden text that spoke of the lunar citadel. His destination lay somewhere beyond the trees, in a place where most dared not tread. A sense of excitement mingled with an undercurrent of dread, creating a knot in his chest. He had dreamt of this moment for as long as he could remember, but now, standing on the threshold of the unknown, a darker question tugged at his mind. Was he truly ready? The Lunar Order. The name was spoken with equal parts reverence and fear in every corner of the magical world. They were said to wield the moon's magic, harnessing both its light and its dark, bending the celestial body's mysterious power to their will. Legends told of their influence on tides, on the cycle of life and death, and on the very fabric of the world itself. Yet those who knew the deeper truths warned of the cost, that to commune with the moon's magic meant to dance with shadows darker than night. The air grew colder as Kael pressed on, his hands trembling despite the thick leather gloves he wore. The eerie stillness of the forest weighed on him, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the brush or the distant call of an owl. The moon, hanging low in the sky, seemed to watch him with a pale, indifferent gaze, offering no comfort, only a reminder of what lay ahead. After what felt like hours, Kael crested a hill, and there, looming before him like a great stone sentinel, stood the lunar citadel. The citadel was a structure both beautiful and terrifying. Its towering spires seemed to pierce the sky itself, reaching up as if in defiance of the stars. The walls were etched with ancient symbols that glowed faintly in the moonlight, pulsating with a strange, rhythmic energy. The silver light they emitted flickered like a heartbeat, casting long, eerie shadows across the stone floor of the courtyard. Despite its grandeur, there was something unnerving about the place, something cold and unwelcoming. It was as though the very stones whispered of secrets too terrible to be spoken aloud. Kael paused at the entrance, his gaze drawn to the enormous moonstone gate. Crafted from the same pale, shimmering stone as the rest of the citadel, the gate was covered in runes and sigils that seemed to pulse in time with the symbols on the walls. It was said that the Moonstone Gate was alive, infused with the magic of the Order, and that it allowed only those deemed worthy to pass through. Taking a deep breath, Kael stepped forward. As his hand reached for the gate, he felt a pulse of energy travel up his arm, a cold electric sensation that shot through his body. The runes on the gate flared briefly, their glow intensifying, before fading back to their usual dim light. With a soft creak, the gate slowly swung open. Kael stepped through. The air inside the citadel was thick with magic, an almost tangible force that weighed on his chest and made the hair on his arms stand on end. A grand hall stretched before him, lined with towering statues of hooded figures, former masters of the Lunar Order, or so the stories said. Each statue held an orb of silver light in its hands, casting an ethereal glow across the hall, but their faces were obscured in shadow. At the far end of the hall stood Master Eldrick, the High Mage of the Order, his presence commanding, though he did not yet speak. Kael, son of no lineage, novice of untamed power. Eldrick's voice echoed through the hall as if carried by the very air itself. His figure was tall and lean, cloaked in robes of midnight blue, his silver hair falling past his shoulders like strands of moonlight. His eyes, sharp and piercing, seemed to see through Kael, as though he could read every secret buried in the young mage's heart. "You have come seeking power, but power is not given, it is earned," Eldrick continued, his voice cold and precise. "And before you can join the ranks of the Lunar Order, you must first face yourself. The darkness within the moon will show you what lies within your soul." With a wave of Eldrick's hand, the floor beneath Kael shifted, revealing a passageway leading down into the earth. A cold draft of air rushed up from the opening, carrying with it the scent of damp stone and something else, something faintly metallic like blood. The moonstone mirror awaited him below. Kael's heart raced as he descended the narrow, spiraling staircase. Each step took him deeper into the belly of the citadel, the walls growing darker, the air colder. The light of the moon felt distant here, as though its power could not reach so far below the surface. At last, the staircase ended in a small, circular chamber, its walls covered in ancient runes that pulsed softly with a dim, silver glow. In the center of the room stood the moonstone mirror. The mirror was unlike anything Kael had ever seen. Its frame was carved from moonstone, the same pale, shimmering rock as the citadel's gate, and it seemed to absorb the faint light from the runes, giving off an eerie, otherworldly glow. The surface of the mirror itself was smooth and dark, like a pool of still water beneath a starless sky. As Kael approached, the mirror seemed to ripple, as though it were alive, sensing his presence. "Look into the mirror," Eldrick's voice echoed in his mind. "See what the moon sees." Kael hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. The air in the chamber grew heavy, pressing down on him like a weight. Slowly, he raised his eyes to the surface of the mirror. First, there was nothing, just darkness. But then, slowly, shapes began to form. Faint outlines of mountains, forests, and cities, all bathed in the pale light of the moon. The vision shifted, the landscape growing darker, shadows creeping across the land like tendrils of ink. The moon in the sky began to change, its once silver surface blackening, as though some terrible force was consuming it from within. And then, from the darkness, they came, creatures twisted and deformed, their bodies half flesh, half shadow, rising from the earth. Their eyes glowed with a malevolent hunger, and their mouths gaped open in silent screams. The moon, now fully black, bled darkness across the sky, and the creatures multiplied, spreading like a plague across the land. The vision was a nightmare given form, a world consumed by shadow and chaos. Kael's chest tightened with fear, but he could not look away. And then he saw himself, standing atop a mountain of corpses, his hands raised to the sky, dark energy crackling from his fingertips. His face was twisted in a savage grin, his eyes black as the void. Around him, the twisted creatures bowed, their slavering mouths chanting his name in reverence. Kael stumbled back, gasping for breath. His vision blurred, and the room seemed to spin around him. For a moment, he thought he might collapse, the weight of what he had seen pressing down on him like a crushing tide. But as the chamber steadied, so did his resolve. He couldn't turn back now. The days that followed Kael's initiation into the Lunar Order passed in a blur of rigorous training and cryptic lessons. Master Eldrick, now his mentor, was a figure cloaked in mystery, his every movement calculated, his every word a carefully measured whisper. The man spoke little, preferring to guide Kael through ancient texts and arcane rituals with a quiet intensity that left Kael both awed and unsettled. Eldric's gaze always seemed distant, as if his mind wandered to places beyond the physical, to realms where light and darkness twisted into one. Despite the oppressive atmosphere of the Citadel, Kael found himself thriving. His magical potential bloomed under the watchful eyes of the Order's masters, and his prowess with lunar magic grew rapidly. He learned to channel the moon's power through intricate spells, manipulating light and shadow, bending them to his will. He could summon illusions, cloak himself in darkness, and even shape the tides of magical energy that flowed through the air. The moon's power felt intoxicating, like a vast ocean of possibility that he had only begun to dip his hands into. Within weeks, Kael had caught the attention of the High Council, a small group of ancient mages who oversaw the Order's activities. They watched his progress with cold interest, their faces always half hidden in shadow, their eyes gleaming like predatory animals assessing their prey. Their presence unnerved him, but he could not deny the pride that swelled within him as he ascended the ranks, his talents placing him among the most promising initiates in the Citadel. But as Kael delved deeper into the arcane studies of the Order, subtle, unsettling truths began to reveal themselves. It started with whispers, hushed conversations that ceased the moment Kael entered a room, lingering glances from the other mages that seemed to carry an unspoken warning. Kael often caught his fellow initiates scribbling down symbols and incantations that were not part of their assigned lessons, strange and twisted glyphs that hummed with a darker, more malevolent energy. When he asked about them, the mages would brush him off, their eyes darting away, their faces pale and tense. During one particularly late evening in the vast library of the Citadel, Kael stumbled upon a tome bound in leather so old it had turned black. The book had no title, its pages filled with runes that twisted and writhed beneath his gaze. He couldn't read them, but the energy that pulsed from the book felt wrong, unnatural, like a living thing waiting to be unleashed. When he brought it to Master Eldric's attention, the sorcerer's expression tightened, but he offered no explanation. "These are not for you to concern yourself with," Eldric said sharply, closing the tome with a wave of his hand. "Focus on your studies. The path of power is long and treacherous enough without distractions." But Kael couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was happening within the Order. And as the days passed, he began to notice changes in the mages around him. Master Thelos, once a gentle and kind mentor to the younger apprentices, had grown increasingly erratic, his eyes wild and bloodshot, muttering to himself about the binding. Saphira, a brilliant young sorceress Kael had admired for her skill with lunar light, had withdrawn into herself, her once bright magic now tainted with an unsettling darkness. It was as though the very walls of the Citadel were absorbing the madness, twisting the minds of those who dwelled within. Kael often found himself walking the corridors late at night, the silence of the Citadel weighing heavily on him. The soft glow of the moonstone torches did little to dispel the oppressive atmosphere, and he felt watched by something lurking in the shadows, something that fed on the Order's growing obsession with forbidden knowledge. He knew he was not imagining it. The air was thicker, the shadows longer, the whispers more frequent. One night, Kael awoke from a dream of the blackened moon and the creatures rising from the earth to the sound of voices. His room, a small stone chamber tucked away in one of the Citadel's lower levels, was dim, the air thick with the cold dampness that always seemed to seep into the walls. He sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. The voices were faint but unmistakable, echoing through the narrow hallway outside his door. Slipping from his bed, Kael crept to the door and cracked it open, peering into the corridor. The voices grew clearer. Two figures, deep in conversation, their words carrying an edge of urgency. One of the voices was unmistakably Eldric's. The ritual of lunar binding is the only way to secure the Order's future. Eldric was saying, his tone calm but laced with something darker, something insidious. The moon's power is vast, but we have barely tapped into its potential. We need to harness the dark side, the part that has been hidden from us for centuries. Kael's heart skipped a beat. The dark side? He had heard of the moon's hidden half in passing, spoken of in legends as a place of nightmares, where light could not reach and where ancient horrors slumbered. The idea of drawing power from such a place was unthinkable. Yet here was Eldric, the master he had trusted, discussing it as if it were the most natural thing in the world. But the darkness is dangerous. The other voice spoke, softer, hesitant. Kael recognized the speaker as Magus Vero, one of the council members who had always seemed more cautious than the rest. We've seen what it's already begun to do to some of our own. The corruption. It's spreading faster than we anticipated. We have control, Eldric snapped, though his voice remained eerily calm. The corruption is merely a side effect, a necessary price for the power we seek. Once we complete the ritual, we will be able to cleanse the Order and command the moon's full potential. Imagine it, Vero, dominion over the very forces of life and death. The world will bow to us. A chill crept down Kael's spine. The ritual of lunar binding wasn't just about power. It was about domination. The Order sought to bend the moon's magic to their will, not just to wield it for themselves but to control the entire world. And worse, they believed that the corruption, whatever it was, could be contained. But the way Vero spoke, the way Eldric dismissed the dangers, made Kael's stomach churn with fear. There was something more they weren't acknowledging, something even they could not fully control. The moon! It's changing, Vero muttered, his voice barely audible. The darkness within it. It's waking up. We will control it, Eldric replied, his voice cold and absolute. There is no other way. The voices faded as the two figures moved down the corridor, leaving Kael standing in the darkness, his mind reeling. The ritual of lunar binding, the corruption, the growing darkness within the moon, it was all connected. The Order was on the brink of something catastrophic, and they were too blinded by their lust for power to see the danger they were courting. Kael backed away from the door, his hands trembling. He felt a rising panic in his chest, the same cold fear he had felt when he looked into the moonstone mirror. The vision of the blackened moon and the twisted creatures haunted him, and now he understood its meaning. The darkness wasn't just a metaphor, it was real, and it was creeping into the very heart of the Lunar Order. He had to make a choice: stay silent and continue to rise within the ranks, becoming part of the Order's grand designs, or try to stop them before it was too late. But as the whispers of corruption grew louder, Kael realized that he might already be in too deep. The full moon hung high above the lunar citadel, casting its silver light over the ancient stone walls. The entire Order had gathered for the grand lunar ritual, a ceremony said to deepen their connection with the celestial body and its arcane magic. The air hummed with anticipation and energy, thick with the scent of incense and burning herbs. The mages, clad in their ceremonial robes of midnight blue and silver, stood in a perfect circle in the great hall, their faces illuminated by the eerie glow of the moonlight streaming through the skylight above. Kael stood among them, his heart pounding in his chest. His mind still reeled from what he had overheard in the days leading up to the ritual, Eldric's chilling words about the ritual of lunar binding, the growing darkness within the moon, and the spreading corruption that infected the Order. Yet, despite his fear, his curiosity burned brighter. The moon's power called to him, cold and intoxicating, a promise of unimaginable strength. If he could harness even a fraction of its magic, he would transcend all limits of mortal power. Master Eldric stood at the center of the circle, his arms raised high toward the full moon. His voice, rich with authority, echoed through the hall as he began to chant the incantations that would call down the moon's energy. The other mages followed his lead, their voices weaving together in a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the very stone of the citadel. As the ritual progressed, Kael felt the power of the moon begin to surge through him. It was unlike anything he had ever experienced. A cold, piercing force that cut through his very soul, filling him with an overwhelming sense of clarity and control. The energy coursed through his veins like liquid ice, sharp and electrifying, making the hairs on his arms stand on end. For a brief moment, he felt invincible, as though he could see through time and space, bend reality to his will. But then, something shifted. The moonlight, once steady and pure, began to waver. The silvery glow flickered, like a candle struggling against a sudden gust of wind. A strange unease swept through the circle of mages, and Kael's eyes flicked upward, drawn to the moon above. A black shadow, like a stain spreading across a pristine surface, crept over the moon. It moved slowly at first, a dark tendril slithering across the pale face of the celestial body, but soon it expanded, swallowing the light. The chanting faltered as the mages noticed the change, their voices growing uneasy. A ripple of fear passed through the circle. "Hold steady," Eldric's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "The ritual must continue. The moon's power is within our grasp." But Kael could feel it, something was wrong. The energy pouring from the moon had changed. What had been cold and powerful now felt twisted, as though the light had been tainted by some unseen force. The coldness that had once invigorated him now chilled him to the bone, turning his blood to ice. The magic that flowed through him was no longer a force of creation. It was a force of destruction, an insidious darkness that seeped into every corner of his mind, whispering terrible things in a voice he could not silence. Suddenly, a scream tore through the hall. Kael whipped around to see one of the mages, a woman named Celine, clutching her head in agony. Her body convulsed violently, her hands clawing at her face as though trying to tear something out from within. The other mages stepped back in horror as her skin began to twist and bubble, her form warping before their eyes. "Celine!" someone shouted, but it was already too late. Her body contorted grotesquely, her limbs elongating and twisting at unnatural angles. Her face, once beautiful, stretched into a horrific mask of pain, her eyes blackening into deep, empty voids. Shadows writhed around her, dark tendrils that coiled around her flesh and merged with it, twisting her into something inhuman. Kael took a step back, his heart pounding in his throat. This was not magic, it was corruption. The dark side of the moon had awakened, and it was consuming them. One by one, more mages fell to the same fate. The power they had sought so eagerly was turning on them, warping their bodies and minds. Their screams echoed through the great hall, a symphony of madness and pain. Those who had not yet been touched by the corruption scrambled to flee, but the creatures that had once been their comrades were faster, their twisted forms fueled by dark magic. They lunged at the fleeing mages, tearing into flesh with claws of shadow and teeth of darkness. Kael watched in horror as the Lunar Order fell into chaos. The once proud and disciplined mages were now reduced to abominations, half human, half shadow, their forms grotesque and nightmarish. Their eyes gleamed with a malevolent hunger as they turned on their brethren, slaughtering anyone who dared to resist. The floor of the great hall was soon slick with blood, the air thick with the stench of death and magic gone horribly wrong. In the midst of the carnage, Kael's instincts kicked in. He had to survive. He had to escape before the darkness consumed him as well. Summoning what little control he had over the moon's magic, Kael cloaked himself in shadow, using the same techniques he had learned to bend light and darkness to his will. The illusion wouldn't last long, but it might be enough to get him out of the citadel alive. Moving swiftly through the chaos, he dodged the monstrous creatures, his heart hammering in his chest as the screams of the dying filled his ears. He descended through the lower levels of the citadel, the once familiar hallways now twisted and nightmarish in the flickering moonlight. Shadows clung to the walls like living things, reaching for him with grasping tendrils. Kael pushed deeper into the citadel, toward the lower chambers where the ancient texts were kept. If there were answers to this madness, they would be hidden in the forbidden knowledge stored below. The air in the lower chambers was colder, the stone walls slick with moisture. Kael's breath came in ragged gasps as he reached the door to the Vault of Shadows, a place he had never been allowed to enter before. The door was sealed with a powerful magical barrier, but in his desperation, Kael raised his hand, drawing on the last remnants of the moon's magic that pulsed within him. With a whispered incantation, the barrier flickered and fell, the door creaking open to reveal rows of ancient tomes, their pages filled with the knowledge of long-dead sorcerers. Kael hurried inside, scanning the shelves for anything that could explain the horrors he had witnessed. His eyes fell on a tattered scroll, its edges worn and faded, but the symbols etched into it glowed with a faint, dark energy. Trembling, Kael unrolled the scroll and began to read. The truth was more terrible than he could have imagined. The power of the moon, the magic the Lunar Order had sought to control, was not a gift of light. It was a force of darkness. The moon had always held two faces, one of pale silver, the other of shadow. For centuries, the Order had drawn only on the light side, ignorant of the true source of the moon's power. But the ritual of lunar binding had awakened the dark side, and with it, the corruption that had been hidden within the moon for ages. The darkness was alive, an ancient, malevolent force that had waited patiently, feeding on the ambitions and desires of those who sought its power. And now, with the ritual, it had been unleashed, twisting the very essence of those who dared to wield it. Kael dropped the scroll, his hands shaking. The corruption wasn't just a side effect of the ritual. It was the true nature of lunar magic. The Order had been fools to think they could control it. The darkness had been waiting for this moment, and now it was free, consuming everything in its path. As the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the chamber, heavy, monstrous footsteps, Kael knew his time was running out. He had to act quickly, but the question was, how? The Lunar Order was falling, and with it, the world would soon follow. The Citadel was no longer a sanctuary of knowledge and power. It had become a battleground of horrors. The once great Lunar Order crumbled under the weight of its own ambition. Its proud mages twisted into abominations, shadows of their former selves. Kael had witnessed the unimaginable. Friends, mentors, transformed into grotesque creatures. their minds shattered by the corruption that now flowed freely from the moon. The air was thick with the stench of death and magic gone wrong, and the corridors, once bustling with activity, were now stained with blood and echoing with the distant screams of the dying. Kael moved cautiously through the lower halls, his thoughts racing. The revelation of the moon's dark nature had shaken him to his core. Everything he had believed in, the power, the knowledge, the promise of greatness, had been a lie. He had come so far, only to realize that the Order's pursuit of lunar magic had led them to ruin. And now he had to decide. Would he follow the same path, or would he forge a new one? His thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of footsteps approaching from behind. Kael tensed, preparing to cast a defensive spell, when a familiar voice called out to him, "Kael." He turned to see Lyara, her figure barely visible in the dim light of the corridor. She moved with an eerie grace, her dark robes flowing behind her like shadows come to life. Her pale face was illuminated by the faint glow of the moonstone torches. But there was something different about her, something off. Her eyes, once bright and full of curiosity, now gleamed with a strange, dark light, and her smile, though soft, was tinged with something that sent a chill down Kael's spine. "Lyara," Kael whispered, his voice tight with tension. "You survived." "For now," she replied, stepping closer. Her voice was calm, almost too calm given the chaos that had overtaken the citadel. "But survival is not enough, Kael. Not for what's coming." Kael studied her, a deep unease settling in his chest. He and Lyara had been close, fellow novices who had trained together, shared knowledge, and supported each other through the grueling trials of the Lunar Order. He had always admired her intelligence and her unshakable confidence. But now, standing before her, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. "You knew," Kael said, his voice low. "You knew about the corruption." Lyara's eyes darkened, her smile fading into a look of understanding. "Yes, Kael, I knew. I've known for some time now." Kael's heart clenched. "And you didn't tell me? You let all of this happen." She sighed, her expression softening. "It's not that simple. The Order, our Order, has been falling into decay for centuries, long before we ever joined. The corruption wasn't some unexpected consequence. It was inevitable. The moon's magic, its true magic, was always about darkness. Light and shadow, two sides of the same coin. The others," she gestured to the chaos above, "they were too weak, too blind to understand it. They couldn't handle the power. But we can." Kael stared at her, stunned. "What are you saying?" Lyara stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "We've been lied to, Kael. The moon's darkness isn't something to be feared. It's something to be controlled. The ritual of lunar binding was just the beginning. The power is still there, waiting to be claimed. We can reshape the world with it. We don't have to fall like the rest of them. We can rise." Her words were seductive, laced with the same ambition that had driven Kael to join the Order in the first place. He could feel the pull, the promise of power, the allure of rising above the destruction, of mastering the very forces that had brought the Order to its knees. But at the same time, he couldn't forget what he had seen. The twisted forms of his fellow mages, the madness in their eyes, the screams of those consumed by the moon's corruption. "Lyara, this isn't power. It's madness," Kael said, his voice shaking. "I've seen what the moon's darkness does. It destroys everything it touches." She laughed softly, a sound that sent a shiver down his spine. "Only if you let it, Kael. Only if you're weak. But we're not weak. We can harness it, bend it to our will. The others weren't strong enough, but we are. Kael hesitated, torn between the ambition that still burned within him and the horror of what he had witnessed. The power Lyara spoke of was tempting, so tempting, but the cost was clear. He could feel the darkness creeping closer, tugging at the edges of his mind, whispering promises of glory and dominion. He knew, deep down, that once he crossed that line, there would be no turning back. Lyara sensed his hesitation and stepped closer, her voice soft and persuasive. "Kael, don't be afraid. Together we can find a way to control it. There's still hope. There's still a chance. We just need the tome of Lunaris." Kael's brow furrowed. He had heard whispers of the tome of Lunaris, an ancient grimoire said to hold the secrets of the moon's magic. It was a forbidden text, hidden away deep within the Citadel's archives, sealed away because of its dangerous power. No one had dared to seek it out, not even the High Council. "The tome of Lunaris," he repeated, his voice laced with doubt. "You think it can help us control the darkness?" Lyara nodded, her eyes gleaming with conviction. "It holds the key, Kael. The rituals, the spells, the knowledge we need to master the moon's magic. With it, we can undo the chaos, reshape the order, and rise above the ashes." Kael's heart pounded in his chest. He was standing on the edge of a precipice, staring into the abyss. Lyara's words were like a siren's call, pulling him toward the darkness, promising him everything he had ever wanted. But he couldn't forget the screams, the twisted faces, the blood-stained halls. The darkness wasn't just a tool. It was a force of corruption, and once unleashed, it consumed everything. Still, Kael couldn't bring himself to say no. "Not yet." "All right," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll go with you, but only to find the tome. After that, we'll decide what to do." Lyara's smile returned, this time brighter, almost triumphant. "Good. You won't regret this, Kael. I promise." Together, they moved deeper into the Citadel, toward the hidden archives where the tome of Lunaris was said to be kept. The journey was treacherous. The lower levels of the Citadel were crumbling, the air thick with the stench of decay and the echoes of distant, inhuman cries. The darkness seemed to press in around them, alive and watchful, as if the moon itself was aware of their presence. As they descended, Kael couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Lyara's movements were graceful, but there was a subtle change in her. Her voice was softer, almost hypnotic, and her eyes had taken on a strange, dark gleam, as though the shadows had begun to seep into her very soul. "Lyara," Kael said cautiously as they reached a massive stone door marked with ancient runes. "Are you sure about this?" She turned to him, her smile unwavering. "Trust me, Kael. This is the only way." But as the door creaked open, revealing the dimly lit chamber beyond, Kael felt a cold dread settle over him. The darkness was deeper here, thicker, almost tangible, and at the far end of the room, resting on a pedestal of obsidian, lay the tome of Lunaris. Its pages shimmered with an unnatural light, the symbols etched into its surface pulsating with power. As they approached the tome, Lyara's hand trembled slightly, her breath quickening. Kael glanced at her, and for the first time, he saw something that terrified him more than the creatures above. The darkness wasn't just around them, it was inside her. And in that moment, he realized that Lyara wasn't just seeking power. She was already becoming one with it. The descent into the forgotten tomb was steeped in silence, save for the echoing drip of water on ancient stone. The walls, lined with forgotten inscriptions and crumbling symbols of protection, seemed to hum with a long-dormant energy. Kael and Lyara moved cautiously through the passage, their footsteps hesitant as they neared the core of the Lunar Citadel's darkest secret. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the very air around them thickened with unseen pressure, urging them to turn back. But Lyara pushed forward, her gaze fixed, her mind lost in the promise of the Tome of Lunaris. Kael followed, though his heart pounded in his chest with a growing sense of dread. The flickering light of their moonstone torches barely cut through the suffocating darkness ahead, but the faint glimmer of the tome's energy could already be felt, an oppressive, dark pulse beckoning them closer. "Here?" Lyara whispered, her voice breaking the stillness as they came to a massive door of dark stone, its surface carved with arcane sigils. This was the final barrier, the tomb of the Tome of Lunaris, sealed by ancient wards to protect the world from the terrible power within. Kael's breath hitched as he gazed upon the door. The wards etched into the stone flickered with an eerie, silver glow, like ghostly chains meant to keep the darkness contained. It was a sight that filled him with awe and terror. "This is it," Lyara said, her voice trembling with excitement. Her eyes, now nearly black with the influence of the moon's magic, gleamed in the dim light. She approached the door, her hand hovering just above the surface of the wards. "We're so close, Kael. Do you feel it?" Kael did feel it. The energy thrumming beneath the stone was undeniable, a dark, intoxicating force that called to him like a siren's song. But with every pulse of that power, visions flashed before his eyes, visions of destruction, of chaos, of a world consumed by shadow. The images were fleeting, but they left a deep scar on his mind. He saw oceans turning crimson, cities engulfed by writhing darkness, and the sky split by a blackened moon that bled shadow across the land. And in the heart of it all, he saw himself, seated upon a throne of bones, ruling over a world of the dead, his hands stained with blood and the weight of unimaginable power crushing his soul. "Lyara," Kael whispered, his voice hoarse, This isn't right." She glanced back at him, her expression softening, though her eyes were wild with ambition. "You're afraid. I understand, Kael, but this is our destiny. The tome holds the power to change everything. We can control it. We can save the world from its own weakness." But Kael shook his head, his heart pounding in his chest. "No, you don't understand. I've seen it, Lyara. The power we're trying to unleash, it's not meant for us. It's not meant for anyone. It will destroy everything." Lyara frowned, her gaze narrowing. "You're letting fear control you, Kael. Don't you see? This is what we were meant to do. This is why we were chosen." Kael's hands trembled as he approached the door, the weight of the final decision pressing down on him. The tome was right behind this barrier, waiting to be freed. All it would take was one final sigil, one final spell to break the wards. And yet, he hesitated, the visions of destruction playing over and over in his mind. "I can't," Kael whispered, backing away from the door. "We're not supposed to have this power. It will consume us, just like it consumed the others." Lyara's eyes darkened further, and her expression shifted from pleading to cold resolve. "If you won't help me, Kael, then you're nothing but a coward." His heart wrenched at her words, but he knew the truth. He had seen what lay ahead if they continued down this path. There would be no salvation, no grand victory, only darkness and ruin. "I won't be a part of this," he said firmly, stepping back. For a moment there was silence. Then, Lyara's voice, sharp and filled with anger, cut through the air. Then step aside, Kael. Kael's breath caught in his throat as Lyara raised her hand, dark tendrils of magic swirling around her fingers. He could see it now, the same corruption that had taken the others, the same shadowy force that had twisted them into abominations. It was inside her, growing, feeding on her ambition and greed. Lyara, don't, Kael pleaded, but it was too late. With a wordless cry, Lyara unleashed her magic, drawing the final sigil across the surface of the door. The wards, ancient and fragile, trembled beneath her power, their silver glow flickering as they began to break apart. The ground beneath them shook violently, and the air filled with a deafening crack as the door split open, releasing a surge of energy so dark and malevolent that Kael staggered backward, shielding his eyes from the blinding eruption. A scream tore from Lyara's throat as the power of the tome engulfed her. Shadows, thick and writhing like serpents, wrapped around her body, pulling her into the depths of the tomb. Her eyes, wide with terror, met Kael's for a brief moment before the darkness swallowed her whole. "Lyara!" Kael shouted, rushing forward, but the force of the magic threw him back, slamming him against the cold stone wall. The tomb had come alive. Dark tendrils of magic erupted from within, curling through the air like living shadows, feeding off the energy that now flooded the room. The tome of Lunaris sat upon its pedestal, glowing with an unnatural light, its pages fluttering as though moved by an unseen wind. Kael struggled to his feet, his vision blurred and his body aching from the impact. The tomb was now a maelstrom of dark magic, and Lyara was nowhere to be seen, lost to the abyss she had unleashed. For a moment, Kael stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as the enormity of what had just happened settled over him. He had warned her, he had tried to stop her, but in the end, Lyara had chosen her path, and now she was gone. But even as the despair threatened to overtake him, Kael felt something stir deep within his soul. A voice, faint but clear, echoed in his mind. "This power, it can still be yours." He shook his head, trying to block it out. The tome, its magic was reaching out to him, calling to him, just as it had called to Lyara. But Kael knew better. He had seen the future that awaited anyone who dared to wield such power. He had seen the darkness, the destruction, the endless suffering. "No," Kael whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the magic swirling around him. I won't let it take me." With one last look at the tome of Lunaris, Kael turned and fled, his heart heavy with grief and guilt. The shadows clawed at his heels as he ran, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Behind him, the tomb sealed itself once more, the darkness retreating into the depths where it belonged. But Kael knew the truth. The abyss had been opened, and it was only a matter of time before it consumed them all. The moon hung high in the sky, a swollen orb of cold, unfeeling light that cast an eerie glow over the ruined citadel. Its once silver walls now bled shadow, dark tendrils snaking through the air like malevolent spirits. The place that had once been the center of knowledge and magic had become a fortress of nightmares, a monument to the darkness that had been unleashed. Kael lay on the rocky outskirts of the citadel, his body battered and broken. The events of the tomb replayed endlessly in his mind. The surge of dark power, Lyara's transformation, the whispers of the abyss still echoing in his soul. He should have died in that moment. But something, perhaps fate or some cruel twist of magic, had kept him alive. Bloodied and weak, Kael had crawled from the depths of the citadel's catacombs, his mind reeling from what had transpired. The tome of Lunaris had taken Lyara, twisted her into something monstrous. He had seen it in her eyes, that moment when she was no longer the woman he knew, no longer the mage who had once shared his dreams of power and knowledge. She was something else now, something far worse. The dark energy had changed her, warping her body and mind into a vessel of pure lunar corruption. Her once bright eyes had become black, bottomless pits that seemed to swallow the light around her. Her skin, once pale and soft, now glistened with a dark, inhuman sheen, as if her flesh had been infused with shadow itself. Lyara had become the very embodiment of the power she sought, but it had come at a terrible cost. Kael had barely escaped, but the horrors were far from over. As he had fled the citadel, the sounds of screams echoed in the halls behind him. The mages who had once served the Lunar Order were now nothing more than twisted aberrations, their forms grotesquely contorted by the same dark magic that had consumed Lyara. They followed her, their former leader, in a macabre dance of madness and destruction, their minds shattered by the lunar darkness that now ruled them. From the safety of the woods beyond the citadel, Kael watched in silence as Lyara rose from the tomb's depths, her presence commanding and terrible. She declared herself the new leader of the Lunar Order, her voice echoing through the night like a death knell. The once proud mages of the Order bowed to her, their wills broken, their bodies transformed into shadow-bound creatures that served her without question. Under Lyara's command, the citadel had become a stronghold of horror. Where once there had been study and the pursuit of magical knowledge, now there was only bloodshed and chaos. The air itself seemed to hum with the corruption that seeped from the moon, filling the citadel with an oppressive darkness that suffocated any trace of hope. Kael knew he couldn't face her alone. Not like this. It was near dawn when Kael finally collapsed, his body unable to take another step. The edges of the forest loomed dark and unforgiving, but Kael had no more strength to go further. His vision blurred as exhaustion overtook him, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. When he woke, it was to the sharp scent of herbs and the warm crackle of a fire. His wounds had been bandaged, his body rested. He blinked against the dim light and found himself in a small, makeshift shelter, a tent hastily constructed from old furs and cloth. "You should be dead," a gruff voice said from the shadows. Kael turned his head, squinting through the dim light to see a figure crouched near the fire, stirring a small pot of something that smelled vaguely medicinal. The figure was tall, with weathered features, silver hair that fell in unkempt waves past their shoulders, and eyes that gleamed with a sharp intelligence. The man, Kael, glanced over his shoulder at Kael, his expression unreadable. "Not many survive what you went through. You're either incredibly lucky or incredibly cursed." Kael's mouth felt dry, and his voice came out hoarse. "Who are you?" "Kael," the man replied, not looking up from his task. "Exiled from the Lunar Order for refusing to partake in their foolish rituals. I've been watching the citadel from a distance ever since, waiting for the day the darkness would come to claim it." Kael struggled to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his body. "You knew?" "I knew they were meddling with things they didn't understand," Kael said, his voice low. "I warned them, tried to stop them, but no one wanted to listen. The power of the moon was too tempting. Now look at them, twisted, broken, and lost." The bitterness in Kael's voice was unmistakable, and Kael could see the weight of years spent in exile etched into the man's face. He wasn't just an outcast. He was a survivor, someone who had seen the truth long before anyone else and had been cast aside for it. What happened to Lyara? It was my fault, Kael whispered, his voice trembling. I could have stopped her. I could have. No, Karaith interrupted sharply. You couldn't have. Once someone chooses the path of darkness, there's little anyone can do to turn them back. Kael clenched his fists, guilt and grief warring within him. But he knew Karaith was right. Lyara had made her choice the moment she reached for the tome. She had been consumed by her own ambition, blinded by the allure of power. Now she ruled over a kingdom of nightmares, and if she wasn't stopped, her influence would spread far beyond the citadel. I need to stop her, Kael said, his voice firming with determination. Before she destroys everything. Karaith gave him a long, searching look, then sighed. If you're serious about this, you'll need more than just determination. You'll need power of your own. Kael frowned. Power? What kind of power? Karaith stood, retrieving a small, weathered book from his pack. There's a way to fight the corruption, a way to sever its connection to the moon. The knowledge is dangerous, forbidden even, but it's the only way. Kael eyed the book warily. Another forbidden ritual? Not a ritual, Karaith said, shaking his head. A weapon. The moon's power can be disrupted, if you know how to counter it. Kael took the book from Karaith, its pages brittle and worn with age. Inside were diagrams, incantations, and notes scribbled in the margins. It was a manual on how to construct something ancient, something powerful. A weapon forged from moonstone, capable of severing the link between the moon and those who wield its magic. But there was a price. Once you forge this weapon, you'll have to wield it against the source of the corruption, Karaith warned. And that source is Lyara. Kael's heart twisted. The thought of facing her, of having to kill her, made his stomach churn. But deep down, he knew there was no other way. I'll do it, he said, his voice steady, though his hands shook as he clutched the book. Karaith nodded, his expression grim. Then we don't have much time. Lyara's army is growing by the day, and soon, she'll turn her attention beyond the citadel. We have to strike before she becomes unstoppable. Together, they began to plot the destruction of the Lunar Order and the end of Lyara's reign of darkness. But as Kael studied the pages of the Forbidden Book, he couldn't shake the feeling that the price of stopping Lyara would be far greater than he ever imagined. And the moon, ever watchful, seemed to pulse with a cold, distant hunger, as if it already knew what was to come. The citadel loomed like a dying beast, its once grand spires now little more than jagged silhouettes against the blood-red sky. The moon, swollen and ominous, had begun its slow crawl toward full eclipse. The air crackled with tension, thick with the stench of decay and the whispers of those lost to the lunar corruption. It was as if the entire world held its breath, waiting for the final blow that would decide its fate. Kael stood at the gates of the citadel, his breath steady but his heart pounding in his chest. By his side, Karaith was grim and silent, his weathered face hardened with resolve. The citadel was barely recognizable from the place Kael had first arrived at. It had transformed into a ruin, consumed by shadows and the dark magic that now ruled it. "Are you ready?" Karaith asked, his voice barely audible over the distant howls of the corrupted mages, who wandered the grounds like restless spirits. Their twisted forms prowled the edges of the fortress, their eyes gleaming with hunger and madness. Kael tightened his grip on the weapon they had forged together, a blade of pure moonstone, infused with the last remnants of lunar light magic. It was cool to the touch, shimmering with a faint silver glow, a stark contrast to the darkness that now surrounded them. But it wasn't just the weapon Kael carried within him. He still felt the pull of the moon's magic, a connection that both empowered and poisoned him. "I'm ready," he said, though doubt gnawed at his soul. The visions of his potential future still haunted him, visions of himself seated on a throne of bones, a king of shadows. But he had made his choice. This was not a battle for power. It was a battle for salvation. As they entered the Citadel's halls, they were met with the full force of Lyara's corruption. The walls bled shadow, grotesque figures twisting out of the stone like living nightmares. The mages who had once walked these halls as scholars of the lunar arts were now little more than puppets, their bodies contorted and warped into horrific shapes, their eyes glowing with the sickly light of the moon's dark side. But Kael and Karaith pushed forward, cutting down any who stood in their way, the moonstone blade cutting through the corrupted mages like light through darkness. Every strike sent a ripple of pain through Kael's connection to the moon, but he pressed on, knowing that the true battle lay ahead. They reached the heart of the citadel, the lunar chamber, where Lyara awaited them. The chamber was unrecognizable from what it had once been. The once glistening walls were now covered in thick, pulsing veins of shadow, the floor slick with blood and darkness. At the center of the room stood Lyara, a figure of terrifying beauty and horror. She was no longer human. Her body had fully merged with the moon's dark power, her skin shimmering with an otherworldly black glow. Her eyes were empty voids, her hair flowing like liquid night. Shadow and light twisted around her like serpents, and her lips curled into a wicked smile as she saw Kael enter. "Kael," she said, her voice dripping with mockery, "you've come to witness my ascension." Kael's heart clenched at the sight of her. Lyara was both the woman he had once known and something far more terrifying. The darkness had consumed her entirely, and yet a part of her still believed she was in control. "It's over, Lyara," Kael said, his voice steady. "You've lost yourself. This power is not meant to be wielded." Lyara laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "Lost? No, Kael. I found true power. The power to reshape this world as it was meant to be, under the light of the moon's shadow." She extended her arms, and the shadows around her coiled tighter, the dark magic pulsing with unnatural life. "Join me. We can rule together, Kael. You know the power you hold. I can feel it in you." Kael's grip tightened on the moonstone blade. He could feel the pull of the darkness within him, the temptation to give in, to embrace the power that coursed through his veins. For a brief moment, he saw what could be, the two of them ruling together, reshaping the world into something entirely new, something terrifying and magnificent. But then he saw the truth in the twisted forms of the mages who had fallen, the truth in the visions that haunted him. This power would not bring salvation. It would only bring ruin. "No," Kael said quietly, stepping forward. "This ends now." With a roar of fury, Lyara unleashed her power, the shadows surging forward like a tidal wave. Kael raised the moonstone blade, its light flaring bright in the face of the oncoming darkness. The two forces collided with a deafening crash, light and shadow battling for dominance. The fight was brutal. Every strike Kael landed seemed to weaken the connection between Lyara and the moon, but each blow cost him as well. The darkness within him grew stronger, the pull of the moon more insistent. He could feel it seeping into his soul, whispering promises of power, of immortality. But he fought on, even as the shadows clawed at his flesh, even as the darkness within him threatened to overwhelm him. This was not just a battle against Lyara. It was a battle against himself. Liara's eyes blazed with fury as she realized she was losing. "You can't stop it, Kael," she screamed. "The moon's power is eternal. You are nothing compared to its might." But Kael knew what he had to do. As the moon reached the peak of its eclipse, Kael made his final choice. He raised the moonstone blade and, with a cry of both pain and defiance, severed his own connection to the lunar magic. The light within him flickered and died, but in that moment, the power that tied the Lunar Order to the moon was shattered. The citadel trembled, the walls cracking as the very foundation of the Order began to crumble. The dark magic that had once flowed so freely now recoiled, as if wounded. Lyara screamed, her form distorting as the power she had wielded so recklessly was torn from her. The shadows that had given her strength now consumed her, and with one final anguished cry, she was swallowed by the darkness she had sought to control. The citadel collapsed around them, the weight of centuries of dark magic finally unraveling. Kael stumbled, barely able to stand as the building crumbled, but he felt a strange peace settle over him, even as the world fell apart. Karaith appeared at his side, pulling him to his feet as the last remnants of the citadel came crashing down. Together, they fled the ruins, emerging into the cold night air just as the moon, now fully eclipsed, cast the world in a deep, silent darkness. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The citadel was gone, reduced to rubble, and with it the Lunar Order. The dark magic that had once threatened to consume the world had been severed. "It's over," Karaith said quietly, though there was no triumph in his voice, only exhaustion. Kael nodded, staring up at the moon, now shadowed and dim. He had given up the power he had once sought so desperately, but in doing so, he had saved the world from the fate he had glimpsed in his visions. But the price had been high. As the moon slowly emerged from its eclipse, casting a faint silver light over the broken land, Kael turned away from the ruins of the citadel. His connection to the moon was gone, but he was free of its darkness. And in the end, that was enough. The shadows within him had been silenced, for now.